You would not have survived in a medieval castle, and now I will tell you why. We are used to seeing medieval castles in movies, majestic, romantic, and full of noble knights. They seem to us to be a symbol of reliability and impregnability. But what if this beautiful picture is just an illusion, hiding a harsh and uncomfortable reality? Behind the thick stone walls lay a completely different life, governed not by the laws of honor, but by the harsh rules of survival. Every day in the castle was a test that modern man would hardly be able to endure.
Speak, messenger. What tidings do you bring from the north?
It was a struggle against cold, hunger, and conditions that we would today call unbearable. Watch this video to the end, and you will find out why the most desirable place in the castle was not the treasury, but the ordinary kitchen, and what simple item of clothing could save the life of its owner. What if I told you that everything you believed about life in a castle was untrue? The first thing a modern person would encounter upon entering the gates of a medieval castle would not be the sight of majestic architecture. It would be a deafening assault on the senses for which it is impossible to prepare. Imagine a modern metropolis with millions of inhabitants, compressed into the size of a small city block, with no soundproofing, air conditioning, or sewage system. A medieval castle was precisely such a concentration of human activity in an extremely limited space. If you were to find yourself there from our time, you would experience sensory overload that could lead to real shock. Your nervous system, accustomed to the controlled environment of a modern home, would not be ready for such an onslaught.
Fresh bread! Get your fresh bread here!
Forget the silence and tranquility of the stone halls we see in museums. The castle was a constantly active organism, a buzzing hive filled with thousands of sounds. From morning to night, you would hear the clang of hammers from the forge, the creaking of carts, the cries of merchants, and the constant hubbub of dozens, if not hundreds, of people living in a confined space. Added to this sonic chaos was a world of smells completely foreign to our sense of smell. Smoke from dozens of hearths mingled with the aromas of food being prepared in huge kitchens. This seemingly pleasant smell was intertwined with the smell of sweat from hundreds of unwashed bodies and the breath of people who did not know toothpaste. The sound environment of the castle was multi-layered and constantly changing. Dawn brought the ringing of bells calling people to prayer. Then the working day began with the shouts of drivers, the barking of dogs, and the mooing of cows in their pens. Blacksmith hammers created a rhythmic metallic background, and the sounds of saws, planes, and looms came from the workshops. Even at night, there was no silence. The snoring of hundreds of sleeping people, the creaking of wooden structures, and the footsteps of the night guard created a constant soundtrack. The olfactory landscape was even more complex. The smoke was not uniform. It carried the aromas of different types of wood, burning straw, and coal. The smells of food being prepared ranged from the appetizing aromas of roasted meat to the sour smells of fermenting dough and sour milk. The strongest impression was the pervasive smell of waste. Sewage systems were primitive, and even in the richest castles, the aromas from the toilets, called garderobes, spread through the corridors. Added to this was the smell from the stables and cattle yards, which were often located inside the fortress walls. Unlike us, medieval people were accustomed to this sensory onslaught from birth. They knew how to filter these sounds and smells, extracting important information from them. For them, it was not a cacophony, but a natural environment, the backdrop to their everyday life. The sanitary conditions of the castle created a special olfactory environment that would be unbearable for modern humans. Wardrobes, toilets built into the castle walls, were often located above moats or rivers, but in dry weather, The smells concentrated and spread throughout the building. Waste from hundreds of people and animals created a constant ammonia background, mixed with the smells of rotting food scraps and stagnant water. Medieval people developed selective perception that allowed them to function in such an environment. Their brains automatically filtered out familiar unpleasant odors, focusing on new signals that could carry important information. The smell of smoke from a fire, the aroma of freshly baked bread, or the stench of disease. For us, this would be the first and perhaps the most difficult challenge. Constant noise would interfere with sleep and concentration, and unfamiliar smells would cause physical discomfort. This invisible wall of sounds and smells separates our era from the past much more reliably than centuries. Modern people seek silence and solitude to rest from the noise of information. In a medieval castle, such luxury simply did not exist. The constant presence of other people was the norm, and silence was an alarming sign that something had gone wrong. Imagine having to live in such a place for just one day. You would not be able to open a window to air out the room because windows were a luxury. You would not be able to go to a quiet place because there were simply no such places. Adapting to such an environment would require a radical restructuring of the nervous system. Modern humans are accustomed to being able to control their environment, to regulate temperature, lighting, and noise levels. In a castle, such control was impossible. You would be forced to accept the environment as it is and learn to function in it. This is not a test of physical endurance, but of your nervous system's ability to adapt. You would have to learn to sleep through the cries of the guards and work without paying attention to the smoke and smells. This is the first barrier that would separate you from the possibility of survival. The psychological consequences of such adaptation would be significant. Constant sensory stress could lead to chronic stress, sleep disturbances, and impaired concentration. However, those who managed to adapt would develop unique skills of perception and information filtering unknown to modern humans. What do you think would be the most difficult challenge for you? Constant noise or unfamiliar smells? Are you ready to learn the truth about why castles were not fortresses, but giant stone refrigerators? Even on the warmest summer day, it was cold inside the castle. Stone walls several meters thick provided excellent protection from enemies, but they were just as effective at absorbing cold and dampness, preventing the interior from warming up. Imagine a modern basement or cave. That's exactly the temperature that the massive stone walls of the castle maintained all year round. The physical laws of thermodynamics worked against the inhabitants. The enormous mass of stone had tremendous thermal inertia, slowly accumulating cold in winter and releasing it just as slowly in summer. If you found yourself in a medieval castle in July, you would discover that the internal temperature barely reaches 10-15 degrees Celsius, roughly the same as in a modern refrigerator. The main and often only source of heat was a fireplace or open hearth. However, in huge halls and chambers, their effectiveness was extremely low. Most of the heat simply escaped through the wide chimney along with the smoke, and only those who were in close proximity to the fire could warm themselves. To combat the cold in some way, the walls of the halls were draped with heavy tapestries. They served not only a decorative function, the thick fabric created an air layer that prevented the cold from the stone from penetrating the room. The efficiency of medieval heating was catastrophically low. An open hearth had an efficiency of about 15–20%. The rest of the energy literally flew out the chimney. In a 200 square meter hall with ceilings 8 to 10 meters high, even a large fireplace could only heat an area with a radius of 2–3 meters. This meant that 90% of the room remained almost as cold as outside. Tapestries functioned as a primitive heating system. The air gap between the fabric and the wall worked on the same principle as modern insulation. The most expensive tapestries were specially woven with pile to increase the amount of air trapped. Sleeping areas were designed to be as protected from drafts as possible. The beds of the nobility were surrounded by heavy canopies made of thick fabric. This created a small enclosed space that could be warmed by the heat of one's own body. Clothing was the main means of individual heating. People wore several layers of wool and fur clothing without taking it off even indoors. Hats and hoods were a mandatory part of the home wardrobe, not only for women but also for men. The canopy turned the bed into a personal greenhouse. Thick curtains created a volume of about 10-15 cubic meters, which the human body could warm relatively effectively during the night. Breathing and natural body heat raised the temperature inside the canopy by 5-10 degrees compared to the surrounding air. Layering clothing was a scientifically sound strategy. Each layer trapped air, creating an insulating effect. A typical winter outfit might include a linen shirt, a wool tunic, a fur vest, and a cloak. A system that could weigh up to 10 kilograms but ensured survival. Fuel was a valuable resource. Firewood and peat were expensive, and their consumption was strictly controlled. Heating the entire castle around the clock was an unthinkable luxury, so only the most important rooms, such as the Lord's chambers and the kitchen, were heated. The usual inhabitants of the castle, servants, craftsmen, soldiers, slept in common barracks or directly in the corridors. They covered themselves with their own cloaks and slept on straw mattresses, trying to keep warm by huddling together. For them, night was the coldest and most unpleasant time of the day. The economics of heating were brutal. The cost of firewood in winter could account for a significant portion of even a wealthy castle's budget. Fuel preparation required the constant labor of dozens of people, cutting, transporting, drying, and storing. A single large fireplace consumed about a cubic meter of firewood per day, which required cutting down several trees. Collective sleeping was not only an economic necessity, but also a survival strategy. A group of 10-15 people sleeping close together could maintain a temperature sufficient to prevent frostbite. This practice required special social organization and rules of conduct. Constant cold was not just uncomfortable, but a serious threat to health. It weakened the body and made it vulnerable to disease. The ability to find and retain heat was one of the key survival skills. Survival in the castle meant constant adaptation to low temperatures. It was necessary to know where to find the warmest place, how to dress properly, and how to use any available source of heat. Without this knowledge, a week in the castle would have turned into an icy ordeal. The medical consequences of living in the cold were serious. Chronic respiratory diseases, arthritis, and frostbite were common. Infant mortality rose sharply in winter precisely because of the inability of small bodies to cope with the constant cold. People developed special skills. They knew how to quickly warm frozen limbs, which herbs helped with colds, and how to recognize the early signs of frostbite. But even if you found a way to warm up, it did not guarantee you a peaceful night. Are you ready to learn why the concept of personal space and privacy was completely foreign to medieval people, and where the inhabitants of the castle actually slept? Here's what happens behind closed doors. Survival in a castle depended not only on the ability to find food and warmth. Much more important was the ability to navigate a complex social hierarchy that was as real as the stone walls. Imagine a modern corporate office where one inappropriate joke could cost you your career, but multiply those consequences 100-fold. In a medieval castle, a social faux pas could cost you your life. If you found yourself in such an environment, you would encounter a system where every movement, every word, and even the direction of your gaze mattered and could be interpreted as a sign of respect or disobedience. Every inhabitant of the castle, from the lord to the lowliest stable boy, had a strictly defined place. This place determined not only his duties, but also what food he would receive, where he would sleep, and even with whom he had the right to speak. Violating these unwritten rules could have catastrophic consequences. Imagine finding yourself in this world without knowing its laws. A simple smile directed at the wrong person or a word spoken at the wrong time could be interpreted as an insult or a breach of subordination. Your life depended on your ability to quickly understand who was who in this labyrinth. Social stratification was visible and tangible. Clothing, jewelry, even the way a person walked signaled their status. There were strict rules about who could wear certain colors, fabrics, or jewelry. Purple was the prerogative of the highest nobility, silk was a sign of wealth, and coarse wool indicated low birth. Body language was just as important as words. The degree of bowing, the duration of eye contact, the position of the hands, all of this conveyed information about social status and relationships between people. A mistake in these nonverbal signals could be taken as a serious insult. Relationships in the castle were not based on friendship, but on a system of vassalage and obligations. Everyone served someone, and in turn, had someone under their command. Trust was a rare luxury. Much more often, relationships were based on mutual benefit and fear of punishment. Your survival depended directly on patronage. You had to find someone higher than you on the social ladder and earn their favor. Only then could you count on protection, food, and a roof over your head. The patronage system functioned as a network of mutual obligations. The patron provided protection and sustenance, and in return expected absolute loyalty and a willingness to carry out any task. These relationships were formalized through rituals, oaths of allegiance, initiation ceremonies, symbolic gifts.
Perhaps the emerald, my lady.
Finding a patron required strategic thinking and patience. It was necessary to study the influential people in the castle, understand their interests and needs, and find ways to make oneself useful. This could be through certain skills, access to information, or simply the ability to entertain a bored lord. Mistakes were not forgiven. Once you lost your patron's favor, you instantly lost everything. You could simply be thrown out of the gates, which in those days was tantamount to a death sentence, especially in winter. Information was the main currency. The ability to listen, remember, and pass on the necessary information at the right time was highly valued. Rumors and gossip were not just entertainment, but a tool for influence and survival. The castle's intelligence network operated on the basis of servants who had access to their masters' private conversations. Maids knew about family problems, cooks knew about guests and their preferences, and grooms knew about travels and plans. This information was sold, exchanged, and used to gain advantages. The timely transmission of important information could bring rewards and status, but careless spreading of rumors or transmission of false information was severely punished. Balancing usefulness and caution required exceptional social intelligence. For modern people, accustomed to personal freedom and direct communication, such a system would be a real minefield. We would have to learn to restrain our emotions, carefully weigh every word, and constantly analyze the behavior of those around us. This is enormous psychological pressure. In this world, it was not the strongest who survived, but the most adaptable. Those who knew how to be inconspicuous when necessary and useful when it was appreciated. Without understanding these social games, a week in the castle would end very quickly and sadly for you. Psychological adaptation to such a system required the development of skills that modern people have practically lost. The ability to read the subtlest nuances in people's behavior, predict their reactions, and manipulate situations to one's advantage. All this was a matter of survival, not career growth. Thus, the main fortress you would have to take was not the castle walls, but the minds of its inhabitants. It was an invisible war in which words, gestures, and glances were the weapons. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries. If you think that the tables in medieval castles were laden with food, as in the movies, you are sorely mistaken. Lavish feasts were rare, and the daily diet of most inhabitants was meager and monotonous. Imagine a modern diet consisting exclusively of bread, porridge, and diluted beer for months on end. Medieval castle dwellers lived in such conditions for most of the year. If you were transported back to that time, you would encounter a diet that a modern nutritionist would call critically unbalanced, but which was the only way to survive with limited resources and primitive preservation techniques. Bread was the staple food, but it was not the fluffy white bread we are used to. Most people ate coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, often mixed with bran, which was very dense and hard. The second pillar of the diet was soup, or pottage. It was cooked in a huge cauldron throughout the day. Everything that was at hand went into the cauldron: grain, beans, vegetables, and, if you were lucky, small pieces of meat or fat for flavor. Bread made up 70–80% of the daily calorie intake. Its texture was so dense that it often had to be soaked in soup or broth to make it edible. Rye bread had a sour taste due to the natural fermentation of the dough, while barley bread was drier and quickly became stale. Pottage was a constantly boiling pot to which new ingredients were added throughout the day. This system made it possible to use any available food as efficiently as possible and to keep hot food for a large number of people at minimum fuel costs. Meat was a luxury available mainly to the nobility and warriors. Ordinary servants and craftsmen saw it on their table only on major holidays. Most often it was salted or dried meat, which had to be soaked and cooked for a long time to make it edible. Fresh vegetables and fruits were also not an everyday food. They were eaten mainly in summer and autumn during the harvest season. In winter, people had to make do with sauerkraut, pickled cucumbers, and dried root vegetables. Canned meat required special cooking skills. Salted meat had to be soaked in several changes of water to remove excess salt, then cooked for a long time until tender. Even after such processing, it remained tough and had a specific taste that modern people would find unpleasant. The lack of vitamin C in the winter diet was a serious problem. Sauerkraut was practically the only source of this vitamin, which explains its importance in the medieval diet. The main drink was not water, but ale or beer. Water from wells and rivers was often unsafe, and the fermentation process killed most bacteria. Ale was low in alcohol, nutritious, and quenched thirst better than plain water. Meal times were strictly regulated. There were usually 2 meals a day, lunch around noon, and dinner in the evening. Breakfast as we know it did not exist. In the morning, people might eat a piece of bread and wash it down with ale. Ale contained about 2–4% alcohol and was rich in B vitamins thanks to yeast. Everyone drank it, from children to the elderly, as it was the safest way to consume liquids. Ale production was a continuous process that required the constant attention of brewers. Eating twice a day was an adaptation to the rhythms of physical labor. People got up at dawn and worked until dark, so the main meals coincided with breaks in work. All food was very salty or spicy. Spices, especially pepper, were used not only for flavor, but also to mask the taste of food that was not always fresh. Salt was the main preservative, allowing meat and fish to be stored for the long winter. For modern people, such a diet would be a real challenge. The monotony of flavors, the coarseness of the food, and the absence of many familiar products, such as potatoes or tomatoes, would quickly lead to fatigue. Our stomachs are simply not adapted to such food. The use of spices was not a culinary delicacy, but a necessity. Meat and fish were often on the verge of spoiling, and hot spices helped to mask the onset of decay. Salt was so valuable that it was often used as currency. The modern gastrointestinal tract, accustomed to processed foods, refined products, and regular meals, would experience severe stress from a medieval diet. The high fiber content in coarse bread and the excess salt and spices could cause digestive disorders. Thus, survival in the castle meant accepting this simple and coarse diet. You would have to forget about gastronomic delights and be happy with any hot soup. After all, in those conditions, food was not a pleasure, but only fuel for hard work. In the next chapter, you will learn how the castle's inhabitants dealt with the most delicate hygiene issues and why this was so important for survival. In a medieval castle, the concept of personal space was virtually non-existent. The idea of having your own room where you could be alone was only available to the lord and his family. Everyone else lived, worked, and slept surrounded by other people. The main center of life was the Great Hall. During the day, guests were received here, court cases were decided, and meals were eaten. At night, this hall was transformed into a huge communal bedroom for servants and lower-ranking soldiers. People slept directly on the floor, laying down straw mattresses or simply their cloaks. There were no partitions or screens. Everyone was visible to each other, and privacy as we understand it today was impossible. Even among the nobility, the level of privacy was minimal. The lord and lady's personal servants often slept in their bedroom, ready to carry out any task at any time of the day or night. The bed was not just a place to sleep, but a symbol of status, and it was rarely empty. Such crowding was caused not only by a lack of space, but also by considerations of safety and warmth. Sleeping together in a large hall was warmer and safer than in small, unheated rooms. The constant presence of other people protected against possible dangers. Work was also collective. Dozens of cooks and their assistants worked simultaneously in the kitchen. The smithy or armory was always crowded. It was impossible to sit in a corner and work quietly alone. This shaped a completely different type of personality. Medieval people were used to always being in the spotlight. They did not experience the discomfort of a lack of privacy that modern people would experience. For us who value personal boundaries and the opportunity to be alone with ourselves, such a life would be extremely stressful. The constant noise, lack of silence, and inability to hide from prying eyes would quickly exhaust our nervous system. It would be an invasion of our personal life, which we are not used to. Surviving in the castle required the ability to be part of a group 24 hours a day. You had to learn to ignore those around you, sleep in a noisy room, and accept that you had no personal space. Without this skill, a week in the castle would have been psychological torture. Thus, life in the castle is life in the public eye. You would have to give up one of the main values of the modern world, the right to privacy. This is another barrier separating us from the people of that era. Want to know a secret that will change your life? The issue of hygiene and waste disposal in a medieval castle was very acute. The health of all the inhabitants depended directly on its solution, so it was approached with the engineering precision available at the time. The main achievement of medieval sanitary thinking was the wardrobe, or toilet. It was not just a room, but a well-thought-out structure, usually located inside a thick wall. It was a small niche with a stone or wooden seat. All waste fell down a special chute. This chute either led outside at the base of the castle wall or into a moat surrounding the fortress. It was a simple but effective system for removing waste from living quarters. However, closets were not available to everyone. They were a privilege of the nobility and were located in their chambers. Ordinary inhabitants of the castle used chamber pots or cesspools located in the courtyard. The contents of the chamber pots were emptied by servants into the same ditches or into specially designated areas. This required daily and not very pleasant work, but it was vital for maintaining order. The castle courtyard was not a place for walking, but a working area where hygiene was subordinate to practicality. Water for drinking and cooking was taken from a well located inside the castle walls. They tried to dig it as far away as possible from places where waste accumulated to avoid contamination. The cleanliness of the well was a matter of strategic importance, especially during a siege. Despite these measures, it was impossible to completely avoid unpleasant odors and unsanitary conditions. People in the Middle Ages were much more relaxed about this than we are. They understood the importance of cleanliness, but their standards were very different from ours. Herbs and incense were used to combat unpleasant odors in living quarters. Floors were sprinkled with fresh straw or fragrant plants such as mint or lavender. This not only helped to freshen the air, but also provided an extra layer of insulation from the cold stone floor. Modern people would have to deal with a completely different level of hygiene standards. It would be difficult for us to put up with the smells and lack of familiar amenities such as toilet paper or running water. This would require serious psychological adaptation. How important do you think your usual sanitation system is to you? In the next chapter, we will find out what people in the castle actually did from dawn to dusk. Life in a medieval castle was subject to a strict routine dictated by two factors: the sun and work. The concept of free time, as we understand it today, was practically non-existent. Every day was filled with the labor necessary to maintain the functioning of this complex system. The day began with the first rays of the sun. Artificial lighting was expensive, so the entire daylight hours had to be used as efficiently as possible. After a short and simple breakfast, all the inhabitants of the castle, from the lord to the servants, set about their duties. For men, the main work was military training or craftsmanship. The soldiers of the garrison practiced weaponry daily, stood guard on the walls, and monitored the condition of the defensive structures. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, gunsmiths, worked in their workshops from morning till night. Women were responsible for running the huge household. They prepared food, cleaned the premises, washed clothes, spun wool, and wove cloth. Work in the kitchen began long before dawn and ended late in the evening, as hundreds of people had to be fed. Even the nobility had their days scheduled down to the hour. The lord managed his lands, received vassals, administered justice, and planned military campaigns. His wife supervised the servants, controlled food supplies, and raised the heirs. The work was monotonous and physically demanding. Most tasks were performed manually without the use of any mechanisms. This required tremendous endurance and patience. Short breaks were taken only for meals. Lunch was the main break in the working day, after which work continued until sunset. After dinner, there was very little time left before bedtime, which people spent in the common room listening to a storyteller or playing simple games. The concept of a day off on Sunday did not exist for most servants and craftsmen. Work stopped only for the duration of church services. Only the most important religious holidays provided an opportunity to take a break from the daily routine. For modern people, accustomed to an 8-hour workday, weekends and vacations, such a rhythm of life would seem unbearable. The lack of time for personal hobbies and leisure would be a serious psychological challenge. It was a life completely devoted to fulfilling one's duties. Survival in the castle meant accepting this continuous cycle of labor. You would have to find your place in this system and perform your function every day without expecting rewards or free time. This was the price for the food, shelter, and protection that the castle walls provided. As the sun set, life in the castle changed dramatically. If the day was a time of noise and bustling activity, the night plunged the castle into a thick, almost palpable darkness and silence. In an era without electricity, the onset of night meant the end of active life. The main sources of artificial light were candles and torches. However, they were an expensive luxury and were used sparingly. Wax candles, which gave off an even and bright light, were only available to the wealthiest inhabitants of the castle. Most people were content with tallow candles or simple splinters. Tallow candles burned unevenly, smoked heavily, and emitted an unpleasant odor. Splinters, thin, long pieces of dry wood, provided very little light and burned quickly, requiring constant replacement. Moving around the huge castle at night was difficult and unsafe. Endless corridors, spiral staircases, and passageways were plunged into complete darkness. A casual visitor could easily get lost or stumble on uneven steps. Due to the high cost and fire hazard, only the most important posts where guards were on duty were illuminated. The rest of the castle was plunged into darkness. The inhabitants of the castle navigated this darkness perfectly, knowing every turn and every step. Night was a time of rest, but not always peaceful. In the darkness, all sounds were heightened. The creaking of floorboards, the howling of the wind in the battlements, the distant cry of a nightbird. To an unaccustomed ear, this soundscape could seem disturbing. The windows in castles were small and few, and glass was a great luxury. Often, window openings were simply covered with oiled cloth or closed with wooden shutters. Therefore, even during the day, many interior rooms were dimly lit. Life, completely subject to the solar cycle, shaped a different perception of time. People made the most of daylight hours and ceased all activity when darkness fell. Night was a time for sleep and rest before a new working day. It would be difficult for modern people, accustomed to brightly lit cities and the ability to stay awake all night, to adapt to such a reality. We would have to relearn how to live according to the laws of nature, where darkness means the end of activity. This would change our entire daily routine and way of life. Survival in the castle required the ability to exist in conditions of limited visibility. It was necessary to learn to appreciate every source of light and not be afraid of the dark. It was a world where shadow was as natural an element as sunlight. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people were not universally dirty. They valued cleanliness and tried to maintain it with the means available to them. However, their understanding of hygiene and their capabilities were completely different from ours. The basis of personal hygiene was daily washing of the face and hands. This procedure was performed in the morning after sleep and always before each meal. For this purpose, a basin of water brought by servants was used. Soap existed, but it was quite expensive and very different from modern soap. It was made from animal fats and ash, and it was quite harsh and had an unpleasant smell. Such soap was used mainly for washing clothes, not for personal hygiene. Taking a bath was a complicated and expensive undertaking. A wooden tub had to be brought into the room, filled with dozens of buckets of water, and then heated by throwing hot stones into it. Therefore, a full bath was a luxury available only to the nobility, and it was not taken every day. Simple means were used to clean teeth. People chewed certain types of wood that freshened their breath or wiped their teeth with a piece of cloth. Of course, this was not as effective as modern methods, but it was an attempt to maintain oral hygiene. Clean clothes were very important. Underwear that came into contact with the body was changed as often as possible and washed regularly. Washing was hard work. The laundry was soaked in lye, boiled, and then beaten with special rollers on the riverbank. Outer garments made of wool and fur were not washed but cleaned with brushes and aired out. To get rid of unpleasant odors and repel insects, clothes were stored in chests along with bags of fragrant herbs. It was a kind of medieval dry cleaning. There was a constant battle against trash in the castle. The floors were regularly swept and sprinkled with fresh straw. Food waste and other rubbish were collected and taken outside the castle. To modern people, these methods may seem primitive. However, in those conditions, it was a whole system aimed at maintaining order and cleanliness. People did everything possible to keep their homes clean and comfortable. Surviving in a castle meant accepting these hygiene practices. You would have to learn to do without daily showers and the usual hygiene products. This would require not only physical, but also psychological adaptation to a different way of life. Life in a castle shaped a special mentality that can be called the psychology of the fortress. Constantly being behind thick stone walls influenced people's worldview and behavior. It was a world clearly divided into inside and outside. On the one hand, the walls provided a sense of security. In an era of constant wars and raids, the castle was an island of safety and stability. Its inhabitants knew that as long as the gates were closed and guards stood on the walls, they were safe from most threats. This sense of security allowed them to lead a measured life. Craftsmen could work in peace, and peasants from the surrounding villages could take refuge behind the walls in case of danger. The castle was the center of life for the entire region. On the other hand, this isolation created a feeling of confinement. People could go months without leaving the fortress. The world outside the walls seemed distant and full of danger. This fostered a strong sense of community, of us and them. All the inhabitants of the castle were part of one large family or team, dependent on each other. Any stranger who appeared at the gates was viewed with suspicion and caution. Life was completely predictable and subject to a set order. Everyone knew their place and their duties. This routine provided stability, but at the same time deprived them of freedom of choice and the opportunity to change anything in their lives. The constant presence of soldiers and weapons was commonplace. The clanking of armor and the changing of the guard were as much a part of everyday life as birdsong. The threat of attack was always real, and everyone was prepared for it. This duality, a sense of security and, at the same time, a feeling of being trapped, was the main feature of life in the castle. People paid for protection and stability with their freedom. It was a conscious choice that seemed to be the only right one at the time. For a modern person who values freedom of movement and openness to the world, such a life in a confined space would be a difficult test. The feeling of being locked up, even if it is for your own safety, could cause claustrophobia. It would be a psychological pressure that we are not used to. Survival in the castle required accepting this psychology. It was necessary to learn to value safety over freedom and to see the walls not as a barrier, but as protection. Without this inner humility, life in the fortress would have turned into imprisonment. We took a journey through time and tried to imagine what it would be like to live in a medieval castle for a week. As we saw, the reality is very different from the romantic images we see in movies. It was a world that required incredible adaptation, endurance, and a completely different outlook on life. The struggle against the cold, monotonous food, lack of privacy, and a strict social hierarchy are just some of the challenges that a modern person would face. Survival in those conditions depended not so much on physical strength as on the ability to accept other people's rules and give up familiar comforts. Perhaps after reading this story, we will begin to appreciate more the simple things that surround us. A warm bed, a hot shower, a variety of food, and, of course, the right to personal space. These are luxuries that the inhabitants of medieval castles could not even dream of. What aspect of life in a castle do you think would be the most difficult for you? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new exciting journeys into the past.